In the summer of 2022, something extraordinary happened in the cold, dark waters of the North Atlantic Ocean. A team of researchers descended nearly 12,500 feet below the surface to the wreck site of the RMS Titanic, armed with technology that would have seemed like science fiction just a decade earlier. Over the course of 6 weeks, remotely operated vehicles captured an astonishing 715,000 images of the legendary shipwreck. These weren't just ordinary photographs. They were meticulously planned, high-resolution captures designed to create something unprecedented, a complete digital twin of the Titanic as it rests on the ocean floor today. When the images were processed and assembled, researchers found themselves staring at details that had remained hidden for over a century. Among the twisted metal and scattered debris, they discovered a valve on the stern section, frozen in the open position. This single piece of evidence, combined with the concave shape of several boilers visible in the wreck, would confirm eyewitness accounts that had been doubted for decades. The engineers of the Titanic had indeed stayed at their posts, keeping the lights burning and the electricity flowing, even as the ship plunged toward its watery grave. These 35 men, working in conditions of unimaginable terror, kept shoveling coal into the furnaces for more than 2 hours after the collision, allowing distress signals to be sent that would ultimately save hundreds of lives. But this wasn't the only revelation. The 3D scan also provided unprecedented clarity about the actual damage caused by the iceberg. For more than a century, many had imagined a massive gash torn along the side of the ship, perhaps 300 feet long. The truth, as revealed by these new scans and accompanying computer simulations, was far different and, in many ways, more tragic. The iceberg hadn't ripped open the Titanic's side. Instead, it had created a series of 6 small breaches, each about the size of an A4 sheet of paper. These punctures were spread across 6 of the ship's 16 watertight compartments. The Titanic had been designed to survive with 4 compartments flooded. With 6 breached, her fate was sealed. The scan even revealed a porthole that had been smashed during the collision, corroborating survivor reports that ice had entered some cabins during those first terrible moments. Perhaps most striking was what the simulation revealed about timing. Using the new data, naval architect Simon Benson from the University of Newcastle calculated that the entire collision, from the moment the lookout spotted the iceberg to the final scraping contact, lasted just 6.3 seconds. 6 seconds that would doom more than 1,500 people and create a maritime disaster that would echo through history. This discovery represents the most significant advancement in our understanding of the Titanic disaster in decades. But to truly appreciate what these findings mean, we need to go back to the beginning, to understand not just how the Titanic sank, but why she was built, what she represented, and how the event of April 14 to 15, 1912 unfolded in ways we're only now beginning to fully comprehend. This is the story of the Titanic, the hidden details that have emerged from the deep, and how new evidence is changing everything we thought we knew about one of history's most famous maritime disasters. To understand the Titanic, we must first understand the world that created her. The early years of the 20th century were marked by unprecedented technological advancement and fierce commercial competition. The Industrial Revolution, which had begun in Britain more than a century earlier, had transformed the world. Steam power, electricity, and steel manufacturing had revolutionized transportation, and nowhere was this more evident than in transatlantic shipping. By 1900, crossing the Atlantic Ocean was no longer the perilous, months-long journey it had been in the age of sail. Modern steamships could make the crossing in less than a week, and millions of people were taking advantage of this new mobility. The transatlantic passenger trade had become enormously profitable. Millions of European immigrants were flooding to America seeking new opportunities, while wealthy travelers moved back and forth between continents for business and pleasure. British shipping companies, particularly the White Star Line and its rival Cunard, were locked in fierce competition for dominance of this lucrative market. The stakes were enormous. The company that could offer the fastest, most luxurious crossing would capture the lion's share of first-class passengers, while also profiting from the hundreds of third-class passengers packed into the lower decks. This competition had driven rapid advances in ship design and construction. Ships were getting larger, faster, and more elaborate with each passing year. The White Star Line, owned by the American financier J.P. Morgan's International Mercantile Marine Company, had a problem. Their rival Cunard had recently launched two revolutionary ships, the Lusitania and Mauritania, both capable of speeds exceeding 25 knots and both designed to capture prestigious Blue Ribbon, the award given to the ship making the fastest transatlantic crossing. The White Star Line couldn't match Cunard's speed, but they devised a different strategy. They would build ships that were larger, more luxurious, and more technologically advanced than anything yet seen on the oceans. They would compete not on speed, but on size and comfort. The result of this strategy was the Olympic class of ships, a trio of vessels that would be the largest moving objects ever created by human hands. The man who would oversee the design and construction of these revolutionary vessels was Thomas Andrews, a naval architect working for Harland and Wolff shipbuilders in Belfast, Northern Ireland. Harland and Wolff had a long-standing relationship with the White Star Line, having built virtually all of their ships. Andrews was a brilliant designer, meticulous in his attention to detail, and deeply committed to both innovation and safety. He would pour his heart and soul into the Olympic-class ships, particularly the second vessel, which would be named RMS Titanic. The name itself was significant. In Greek mythology, the Titans were the giant deities who ruled before the Olympian gods. By naming their ship Titanic, the White Star Line was making a bold statement about ambition and achievement. The Olympic-class ships were designed to be approximately 882 feet long and 92 feet wide, with a gross tonnage of about 46,000 tons. They would stand as tall as an 11-story building when measured from keel to the top of their funnels. Each ship would have 9 decks and be capable of carrying over 2,400 passengers and 900 crew members. The first-class accommodations would be nothing short of palatial, featuring luxury suites, a grand staircase, a swimming pool, a gymnasium, and even a Turkish bath. The dining saloon would be the largest room ever built into a ship. The White Star Line spared no expense in making these vessels the epitome of Edwardian luxury. The Titanic's construction began on March 31, 1909, at the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast. The ship was built alongside her sister ship, the Olympic, in specially constructed gantries that towered over the Belfast skyline. The construction would take more than 3 years and employ thousands of skilled workers, from riveters and welders to carpenters and electricians. The ship's keel, the backbone of the vessel, was laid first, consisting of massive steel plates riveted together. From this foundation, the ship's frame rose, a skeleton of steel beams that would give the vessel its shape and strength. One of the most publicized features of the Titanic was her system of watertight compartments. The hull was divided into 16 separate compartments by 15 transverse bulkheads. These bulkheads extended upward to E-deck, approximately 11 feet above the waterline, with some extending even higher. The idea was simple but seemingly effective. If the ship's hull were breached, watertight doors could be closed, either manually or by an automatic system triggered from a bridge, sealing off the damaged section and preventing water from spreading throughout the ship. Thomas Andrews had calculated that the ship could survive with any 2 of these compartments flooded, and even with certain combinations of 3 or 4 compartments breached. This system led to the belief, widely promoted by the White Star Line's marketing materials and echoed in the press, that the Titanic was virtually unsinkable. It's worth noting that the White Star Line never actually claimed the ship was completely unsinkable, but they certainly encouraged that perception. The trade magazine Shipbuilder described the ship's safety features in glowing terms, suggesting that the ship was practically unsinkable. The public seized on this idea, and soon the notion that the Titanic could not be sunk had become accepted wisdom. This confidence was reinforced by the ship's other safety features, including a double bottom, a secondary hull beneath the main hull designed to protect against damage from running aground. The ship's propulsion system was equally impressive. The Titanic was powered by 2 massive reciprocating 4-cylinder triple-expansion steam engines, each driving a 3-blade propeller, plus a low-pressure turbine that drove a central propeller. These engines were fed by 29 boilers, containing 159 furnaces that could consume 600 tons of coal per day at full speed. The engines generated about 46,000 horsepower and could drive the ship to a maximum speed of 23 to 24 knots, or roughly 26 to 28 miles per hour. While not as fast as the Cunard speedsters, this was still impressive for a ship of such enormous size. The The Titanic was also equipped with the latest in maritime communication technology. She carried a Marconi wireless telegraph system operated by two Marconi Company employees, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride. This system could transmit messages over distances of several hundred miles, allowing the ship to stay in contact with other vessels and with shore stations. At the time, wireless telegraphy was still a relatively new technology, and its importance for maritime safety was only beginning to be fully appreciated. The Titanic's wireless room would play a crucial role in the disaster that was to come. Throughout the construction, Thomas Andrews was a constant presence, overseeing every detail of the build. He was known for his hands-on approach, often climbing through the ship's interior spaces to check on the quality of workmanship. Those who worked with him remembered him as demanding but fair, a perfectionist who would accept nothing less than the best. He made numerous small modifications during construction, always seeking to improve safety and functionality. In one famous incident, he reduced the number of lifeboats from 48 to just 16, plus 4 collapsible boats, arguing that more boats would clutter the deck and detract from the ship's appearance. This decision, made with the approval of the Board of Trade, which set maritime safety regulations, would prove catastrophic. The Titanic carried lifeboats with a capacity of about 1,178 people, only about half the number of people actually on board for the maiden voyage. On April 10, 1912, the RMS Titanic prepared for her maiden voyage from Southampton, England, to New York City. The ship had completed her sea trials in Belfast and had been declared fit for service. She had then sailed to Southampton, where she would take on passengers and cargo. The atmosphere was electric with excitement. Thousands of spectators lined the docks to catch a glimpse of the magnificent new ship. Newspapers have been filled with stories about the vessel for months, describing her luxury and technological sophistication in breathless terms. The passenger list for the maiden voyage read, like a who's who of early 20th century society. Among the first-class passengers were some of the wealthiest and most prominent people in the world. John Jacob Astor IV, one of the richest men in America, was aboard with his young pregnant wife, Madeline. Benjamin Guggenheim, a mining magnate, was traveling to New York. Isidore Straus, co-owner of Macy's department store, was accompanied by his wife, Ida. Margaret Molly Brown, the wealthy American socialite who would later be dubbed the unsinkable Molly Brown, was returning home from a European vacation. J. Bruce Ismay, chairman and managing director of the White Star Line, was also on board, eager to see his company's latest achievement make a successful crossing. The second-class accommodations on the Titanic would have been considered first class on most other ships. These passengers included professionals, clergy, and middle-class families seeking new opportunities in America. The third class, or steerage, passengers were primarily immigrants from across Europe, Ireland, Scandinavia, Italy, Syria, and many other countries. They were seeking passage to America, drawn by the promise of jobs, land, and freedom. For them, the journey represented hope for a better future. Many had saved for years to afford the ticket, which cost about £7, equivalent to several months' wages for a working-class family. Also aboard was Thomas Andrews himself. It was standard practice for senior designers to accompany new ships on their maiden voyages to observe performance and note any necessary adjustments. Andrews brought with him a notebook in which he meticulously recorded observations and suggestions for improvements to the Titanic and her still incomplete sister ship, the Britannic. He noted things like the need for additional coat hooks in passenger cabins and suggested changes to the heat output from the engines. He moved throughout the ship constantly, talking with passengers and crew, ensuring everything was functioning as designed. The Titanic's maiden voyage almost ended before it began. As the massive ship was being maneuvered out of Southampton Harbor, the displacement of water caused by her enormous hull created powerful suction that pulled another vessel, the SS New York, from her moorings. The New York swung toward the Titanic, and collision seemed inevitable. Only quick action by the Titanic's captain, Edward Smith, in ordering full astern and the intervention of a tugboat managed to prevent disaster. The near miss should perhaps have been taken as an omen, but instead, it was viewed as a testament to Captain Smith's skill and experience. Captain Smith was, at 62, one of the most respected mariners in the world. Known as the millionaire's captain, He was renowned for his professionalism and his ability to make wealthy passengers feel secure. The maiden voyage of the Titanic was to be his final voyage before retirement, a fitting capstone to a long and distinguished career. After leaving Southampton, the Titanic made stops in Cherbourg, France, and Queenstown, now Cove, Ireland, to take on additional passengers. By the time she left Ireland on the afternoon of April 11, 1912, the ship carried approximately 2,224 people, 1,317 passengers, and 907 crew members. The first days of the voyage were, by all accounts, delightful. The weather was calm, and the Titanic performed beautifully. Passengers marveled at the ship's luxury and stability. The first-class passengers enjoyed elaborate multi-course meals in the grand dining saloon, strolled the promenade decks, exercised in the gymnasium, and socialized in the elegant lounges. Second-class passengers enjoyed accommodations that rivaled first class on many other ships, with comfortable cabins and their own dining room. Even third-class passengers, while crowded, had access to basic but clean accommodations and communal spaces where they could gather and socialize. Captain Smith was following a route known as the Southern Track, used by westbound ships during the winter and spring months when icebergs posed a danger to North Atlantic shipping. These icebergs calved from glaciers in Greenland and were carried south by ocean currents. In April, when the Titanic was making her crossing, icebergs were expected in the shipping lanes, but they were considered a manageable hazard. Ship's officers kept careful watch, particularly at night, and vessels routinely altered course to avoid ice when it was spotted or reported. On April 12, 13, and 14, the Titanic's wireless operators received multiple ice warnings from other ships in the area. These messages reported icebergs, growlers, smaller pieces of ice that floated low in the water, and ice fields at various positions near the Titanic's planned route. The SS Coronia, Baltic, America, Californian, and several other ships all sent warnings. Some of these messages were delivered to Captain Smith on the bridge. Others were never passed along to the bridge crew because they weren't specifically addressed to the captain, and the wireless operators were busy with a backlog of personal messages from passengers. There's been much speculation over the years about whether J. Bruce Ismay, the White Star Line chairman, pressured Captain Smith to maintain speed despite the ice warnings, hoping to arrive in New York ahead of schedule and generate positive publicity. Some witnesses reported seeing Ismay holding one of the ice warning messages for several hours before returning it to the captain. However, no definitive evidence has ever been found that Ismay explicitly ordered the ship to continue at full speed. What is known is that the Titanic did not reduce speed as she entered the ice region on the evening of April 14, 1912. This was not unusual for the time. The common practice among experienced captains was to maintain speed unless ice was actually sighted, relying on lookouts to spot danger in time for the ship to maneuver. It was a practice that had worked countless times before. On the evening of April 14th, the temperature began to drop noticeably as the sun set. Officers and crew members commented on the unusual cold. The sea was remarkably calm, described by survivors as like glass or like a mill pond. There was no moon, making visibility difficult despite the clear sky and bright stars. At 9:30 p.m., Captain Smith attended a dinner party in his honor, left shortly before 10 p.m., and stopped by the bridge to discuss the ice situation with Second Officer Charles Lightoller. Smith noted the calm conditions and told Lightoller to inform him if conditions became at all doubtful. He then retired to his cabin, leaving the ship in Lightoller's capable hands. At 10 p.m., the watch changed, and First Officer William Murdoch took over from Lightoller. At 10:55 p.m., the SS Californian, a ship about 19 miles away from the Titanic's position, sent a warning that she had stopped for the night because she was surrounded by ice. The message was so close and strong that it hurt the ears of Jack Phillips, the Titanic's senior wireless operator, who was busy sending passenger messages through a relay station at Cape Race, Newfoundland. Phillips, exhausted from a long day of work and frustrated by the interruption, snapped back with a message telling the Californian to shut up and stop interfering. The Californian's wireless operator, rebuffed and with his watch ending, turned off his equipment and went to bed. The Californian's critical warning about ice directly in the Titanic's path never reached the bridge. At 11:40 p.m. on April 14th, 1912, Frederick Fleet, one of two lookouts stationed in the crow's nest high above the Titanic's bow, spotted something dead ahead. In the darkness, a massive shape emerged from the night, an iceberg, black against the star-filled sky, because there was no moon to illuminate it. Fleet immediately struck the warning bell 3 times, the signal for an object ahead, and picked up the telephone to the bridge. 6th Officer James Moody answered. "Iceberg right ahead," Fleet reported. Moody relayed the warning to 1st Officer Murdoch, who was in command of the bridge. Murdoch reacted quickly and according to standard procedures. He ordered hard a starboard, which, due to the counterintuitive tiller command still in use at the time, actually turned the ship to port or left. He also ordered the engine stopped and then put into reverse. These were the correct actions based on the training and experience of the time. The idea was to turn the ship and slow it down simultaneously to avoid the obstacle. But these actions, while correct in principle, could not overcome the basic physics of the situation. The Titanic was traveling at approximately 22.5 knots, or about 26 miles per hour. She weighed 46,000 tons. Stopping or turning such a massive object moving at such speed required time and distance that simply didn't exist. The new 3D scan and computer simulations have revealed exactly how little time there was. From the moment Fleet spotted the iceberg to the moment of impact was just 6.3 seconds. In those precious seconds, the Titanic did begin to turn. Her bow started swinging to port, and for a moment, it seemed that she might miss the iceberg entirely. But she didn't miss it. The iceberg scraped along the starboard side of the ship, below the waterline and just above the keel. The contact lasted about 10 seconds as the ship slid past the berg. On the bridge, officers felt only a slight jarring. Many passengers felt nothing at all, or were merely aware of a gentle vibration. Some passengers on the lower decks reported seeing ice falling onto the forward well deck. A few third-class passengers in forward cabins found ice entering their rooms through damaged portholes. The popular image of the collision, reinforced by decades of dramatizations, was that the iceberg tore a massive gash in the side of the Titanic. The reality, as the new research has revealed, was very different and perhaps even more tragic. The iceberg didn't rip open the side of the ship. Instead, the glancing collision created a series of 6 narrow openings along the starboard side, each roughly the size of a piece of A4 paper. The total area of damage was only about 12 to 13 square feet. In modern terms, this is roughly equivalent to the size of a small coffee table. It seems almost impossible that such relatively small breaches could sink the largest ship in the world, but the location and distribution of those breaches made all the difference. The damage extended across 6 of the ship's 16 watertight compartments: the forepeak tank, the 3 forward cargo holds, number 6 boiler room, and a portion of number 5 boiler room. As we noted earlier, the Titanic was designed to stay afloat with any 2 compartments flooded and could survive certain combinations of 3 or even 4 compartments breached. But 6 compartments were too many. The physics were inexorable. As water poured into the forward compartments, the bow would gradually sink lower. Eventually, water would reach the top of the bulkheads and spill over into the next compartment, then the next, in a process that could not be stopped. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer who was aboard, understood this immediately when he inspected the damage. The Titanic was doomed. Down in the forward sections of the ship, the reality of the situation was immediately apparent. Frederick Barrett, a leading fireman working in boiler room number 6, witnessed a collision from below. He reported that water came pouring into the hull with enormous force, and the watertight door between boiler room 6 and 5 nearly failed to close before water could flood through. Engineers Herbert Harvey and Jonathan Shepard were in boiler room number 5 when, about 30 minutes after collision, the bunker door separating it from the flooded boiler room 6 collapsed, and a wave of green foam swept both men to their deaths. The collision might have seemed minor to passengers in the upper decks, but for those working the bowels of the ship, it was immediately catastrophic. For more than a century, survivors of the Titanic disaster recounted a remarkable detail. The light stayed on throughout the sinking, almost until the very end, even as the ship's bow plunged deeper and the stern rose higher into the night sky. The electric lights continued to burn, illuminating the terrible scene and allowing distress signals to be sent. These accounts credited the ship's engineers, who had remained at their posts deep in the ship, keeping the generators running even as the ship filled with water. However, some historians question these accounts. How could the engineers have continued working with water flooding the lower decks? Wouldn't they have been forced to evacuate? The engineers left no first-hand accounts because none of them survived. The 2023 3D scan has provided compelling physical evidence that the survivor accounts were accurate and that the engineers' heroism was even more extraordinary than previously understood. The scan revealed details that had been hidden in the wreckage for over a century. The digital twin shows a clear view of one of the large boiler rooms, located at the rear of the bow section where the ship broke apart. Several of the massive boilers visible in this room are concave, deformed inward. This deformation is crucial evidence because it indicates that these boilers were still hot and under pressure when they were suddenly submerged in the frigid seawater of the Atlantic. Hot metal contracts differently than cold metal when exposed to extreme temperature changes, creating the concave deformation visible in the scan. Even more telling is another detail discovered in the stern section of the wreck. Lying on the deck, researchers found a valve clearly positioned in the open position. This valve controlled the flow of steam from the boilers to the ship's electrical generation system. The fact that it was open when the ship sank proves that steam was still flowing, meaning the boilers were still operating and generating the electricity that powered the lights, the wireless equipment, and other electrical systems aboard the ship. This physical evidence confirms what survivors had reported. The engineers stayed at their posts, shoveling coal into the furnaces and maintaining steam pressure for more than 2 hours after the collision. The implications of this discovery are profound. The Titanic's engineering crew consisted of 35 men, led by Chief Engineer Joseph Bell. These men worked in mechanical spaces deep in the ship, the boiler rooms, the engine rooms, the electrical generation rooms. After the collision, they would have been immediately aware of the danger. Water was flooding the forward boiler rooms. They could hear and feel the impact, yet they remained at their posts, maintaining the systems that gave everyone else aboard a chance at survival. By keeping the lights on, they allowed the crew to see what they were doing as they prepared and loaded lifeboats in the darkness. By keeping the steam pressure up, they ensured that the wireless operators could continue sending distress signals. Those distress signals would save hundreds of lives. The CQD and SOS signals sent from the Titanic were received by multiple ships. The SS Californian, unfortunately, had turned off her wireless for the night and never received the calls for help. But the RMS Carpathia, approximately 58 miles away, received the distress signal and immediately turned toward the Titanic at maximum speed. Captain Arthur Rostron of the Carpathia would later be hailed as a hero for his quick response, but his heroism was enabled by the Titanic's engineers, who kept the wireless system powered long enough for the message to get through. Without their sacrifice, the wireless would have gone dark, and the Carpathia might never have known to come to the rescue. The death toll, already horrific at approximately 1,500 people, could have been even higher. The engineers worked in conditions that are difficult for us to imagine. The machinery spaces were hot even under normal conditions. Temperatures could exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The noise was deafening. As the ship began to sink, these men knew they were in the most dangerous position on the vessel. They were below the waterline, deep in the ship, with limited means of escape. As water flooded the forward compartments, it would eventually reach their workspace. They could have abandoned their posts and sought safety on the upper decks. Some of them might have survived if they had done so, but they stayed. They stayed because they understood that their work was giving others a chance to survive. They stayed because they were professionals who took their duties seriously. They stayed because leaving would have meant condemning everyone else aboard to die in darkness. Once Thomas Andrews had inspected the damage and delivered his grim verdict, Captain Smith understood that the ship was doomed. He ordered the lifeboats to be uncovered and prepared for launching. The wireless operators were instructed to begin sending distress signals. The ship's musicians were told to assemble on the deck and play music to keep passengers calm. What followed was 2 hours and 40 minutes of controlled chaos, heroism, cowardice, and ultimately tragedy on a scale the modern world had never seen. Loading the lifeboats proceeded in a disorganized manner. Many passengers didn't believe the ship could actually sink and were reluctant to leave the warmth and apparent safety of the massive vessel for a small boat on the dark, freezing ocean. The crew had never conducted a proper lifeboat drill with passengers, and many officers were unsure of the procedure. On the port side, Second Officer Lightoller interpreted the captain's order of women and children first strictly, allowing only women and children into the boats and turning away men, even when boats had empty seats. On the starboard side, First Officer Murdoch interpreted the order more liberally, allowing men aboard if no women or children were waiting. As a result, many lifeboats left the ship only partially filled. Lifeboat 1, with a capacity of 40 people, departed with only 12 aboard. Lifeboat 7, the first to be launched, carried only 28 people, though it could hold 65. The shortage of lifeboats, which had seemed like such a minor issue during construction, now revealed itself as a catastrophic failure of planning and regulation. Even if every lifeboat had been filled to capacity, they could only accommodate about 1,178 people. There were approximately 2,224 people aboard. Simple arithmetic made it clear that more than 1,000 people would die. As this reality became apparent, the organized evacuation began to break down. Some passengers rushed the boats. Third-class passengers, many of whom had been trapped below by locked gates and confusing corridors, began flooding onto the boat deck. Officers resorted to firing warning shots with pistols to maintain order. Throughout the ordeal, the ship's bow continued sinking lower and lower into water, while the stern gradually rose higher. By 2 a.m., the forward well deck was completely underwater. The water had reached the bridge. The ship's angle was becoming steep enough that people and objects were beginning to slide toward the bow. At approximately 2:15 a.m., the lights flickered once, twice, then went out entirely. The engineers could maintain power no longer. In the darkness, passengers and crew members on the deck or in the lifeboats heard a tremendous roar from inside the ship as everything not secured, furniture, equipment, machinery, coal, cargo, broke loose and tumbled forward. The noise was described by survivors as sounding like the crashing of thousands of dishes or like distant thunder. At approximately 2:18 a.m., the stress on the ship's structure reached the breaking point. The Titanic broke in two between the third and fourth funnels. The new 3D scan has provided unprecedented detail about how this breakup occurred, and the findings challenge some earlier theories. The ship didn't simply split along a clean line. Instead, the breakup was violent and chaotic. The hull fractured, but parts remained connected by the decking and the keel. The bow section, now completely flooded and enormously heavy, pulled away from the stern section. The two parts may have remained partially connected for several seconds, with the bow section pivoting downward while the stern section rose up. This violent tearing motion explains why the wreck site shows such extensive damage at the point of breakup, and why debris is scattered over such a wide area. After the bow section broke away and disappeared beneath the surface, the stern section, relieved of the weight pulling it down, briefly settled back to a more level position. Survivors in the lifeboats reported that the stern appeared to right itself for a moment, almost floating horizontally. This gave false hope to some that perhaps the stern section, with its still intact watertight compartments, might remain afloat. But the reprieve lasted only seconds. Water was pouring into the stern through the open end where it had separated from the bow. The stern began to rise again, this time even more steeply, until it was nearly vertical in the water. Hundreds of people still clinging to the deck rails, and any handhold they could find slid or fell into the freezing water. At 2:20 a.m., approximately 2 hours and 40 minutes after the collision, the stern section of the Titanic slipped beneath the surface and disappeared. The ship was gone. The 700 or so survivors in the lifeboats now faced a nightmare of a different kind. The air temperature was below freezing, and the ocean water was approximately 28 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to kill a person through hypothermia in as little as 15 minutes. Many of the lifeboats had launched with insufficient provisions, no food, no water, and in some cases, no oars or lights. The survivors were surrounded by the cries of hundreds of people struggling in the water, calling for help. The sound was described by survivors as one of the most haunting things they had ever heard, a collective wail of agony that gradually diminished as, one by one, those in the water succumbed to the cold. The question of why the lifeboats didn't return to pick up survivors from the water remains controversial to this day. With few exceptions, the boats did not go back. Some survivors argued that they wanted to return, but were outvoted by others who feared the boats would be swamped by panicked swimmers and everyone would drown. Others were honest about their fear and reluctance. Fifth Officer Harold Lowe was one of few who did attempt a rescue. He transferred passengers from his boat to others to make room, then rowed back into the debris field. He managed to pull several people from the water, though most were already dead. In total, only about a dozen people were rescued from the water. The rest, perhaps 1,500 people, died from hypothermia within 30 minutes of entering the ocean. The survivors in the lifeboat spent hours in the darkness, cold, shocked, and uncertain of their fate. They knew distress signals had been sent, but would help arrive in time? Would anyone come at all? As dawn approached, they began to see lights on the horizon and the outline of a ship steaming toward them. It was the RMS Carpathia, which had received the Titanic's distress signals and had raced through the night at maximum speed, dodging icebergs in the darkness in a feat of seamanship that Captain Rostron would be celebrated for. The Carpathia arrived at approximately 4 a.m. and began the slow process of picking up survivors from the lifeboats. The scene that greeted the Carpathia's crew and passengers was surreal and tragic. The lifeboats appeared one by one out of the early morning light, some barely afloat, filled with shocked and traumatized people. Women had lost their husbands. Children had lost their parents. The crew of the Carpathia worked for 4 hours to take all the survivors aboard, providing them with food, warm drinks, blankets, and medical attention. Many survivors were in shock, unable to speak or comprehend what had happened. Others wept uncontrollably. Some appeared remarkably composed, maintaining the stiff upper lip that Edwardian society valued. Once all the survivors were aboard, Captain Rostron conducted a brief religious service for the dead, then turned the Carpathia toward New York. During the voyage, survivors struggled to come to terms with what had happened. Wireless operator Harold Bride, who had survived despite suffering from frostbite on his feet, helped the Carpathia's wireless operator send messages. Bruce Ismay, the White Star Line chairman who had saved himself by boarding a lifeboat, remained secluded in a cabin, reportedly in a state of shock and guilt. The Carpathia arrived in New York on the evening of April 18, 1912. For days after the disaster, thousands of people lined the docks, desperate for news of loved ones. The arrival was chaotic, emotional, and marked the beginning of a period of intense public scrutiny, investigation, and recrimination that would last for years. The public reaction to the Titanic disaster was immediate and intense. How could the newest, largest, most technologically advanced ship in the world, widely believed to be unsinkable, go down on her maiden voyage with a loss of more than 1,500 lives? Someone had to be held accountable. 2 major official inquiries were quickly convened. The U.S. Senate inquiry, led by Senator William Alden Smith, and the British Board of Trade inquiry, led by Lord Mersey. Both inquiries heard testimony from survivors, crew members, officials from the White Star Line, and maritime experts. The transcripts of these inquiries run to thousands of pages and provide a detailed, if sometimes contradictory, picture of what happened. The U.S. inquiry began on April 19, 1912, just 1 day after Carpathia arrived in New York, and continued until May 25th. Senator Smith, though not a maritime expert, proved to be a tenacious and determined questioner. He was particularly interested in why Bruce Ismay had survived when so many others had died, whether the ship had been traveling too fast given the ice warnings, and why the SS Californian, which had been relatively close to the Titanic, had not responded to distress signals. The inquiry heard from 82 witnesses and examined numerous aspects of the disaster. While some of Senator Smith's questions revealed his lack of maritime knowledge, he famously asked witnesses whether icebergs could be tracked and avoided. The inquiry ultimately produced a comprehensive report that was critical of the White Star Line and called for significant reforms in maritime safety. The British inquiry, which began on May 2nd and concluded on July 3rd, 1912, was more technical and perhaps more forgiving of the White Star Line. This was partly because the inquiry was conducted by maritime professionals who understood the challenges of operating large ships, and partly because there was a desire in Britain to protect the reputation of British shipbuilding and seamanship. The inquiry heard from 96 witnesses and examined technical details of the ship's construction, the ice warnings received, the actions of Captain Smith and his officers, and the performance of the crew during the evacuation. Lord Mersey's final report spread blame around rather than pointing fingers at specific individuals, though it was critical of Captain Smith for maintaining speed despite ice warnings, and of the SS Californian for not responding to distress signals. Both inquiries grappled with trying to understand the physical damage to the ship. Without the ability to examine the wreck, which lay more than 12,000 feet below the surface, far beyond the reach of any technology available in 1912, investigators had to rely on survivor testimony and expert analysis. Edward Wilding, the chief naval architect for Harland and Wolff, who had worked under Thomas Andrews on the Titanic's design, testified at the British inquiry. Based on calculations of how quickly water flooded the forward compartments, Wilding estimated that the total area of the hull open to the sea was approximately 12 square feet. This was remarkably accurate, as we now know from modern examinations of the wreck. But at the time, many people found it hard to believe that such a relatively small amount of damage could sink such a large ship. The inquiries resulted in significant changes to maritime safety regulations. The International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, SALAS, was established in 1914, mandating that ships carry enough lifeboats for everyone aboard, that lifeboat drills be conducted regularly, and that ships maintain 24-hour radio watch. The Ice Patrol was established to monitor iceberg dangers in the North Atlantic. These reforms, born from tragedy, have undoubtedly saved countless lives in the decades since. Yet many questions about the Titanic disaster remain unanswered. The ship lay undiscovered on the ocean floor, her secrets hidden in the darkness and cold, more than 2 miles down. For more than 7 decades after the sinking, the wreck of the Titanic remained lost. Many expeditions attempted to find her, but the technology simply didn't exist to search effectively at such depths. The Titanic lay at approximately 12,500 feet below the surface, more than 2 miles down, where the pressure is crushing and sunlight never penetrates. It wasn't until the 1970s and 1980s, with the development of deep-sea submersibles and remote sensing technology, that a serious search became feasible. Even then, the challenges were enormous. The search area, based on the distress positions transmitted by the Titanic's wireless operators and accounts from the Carpathia, cover hundreds of square miles. The ocean floor in that region is not flat, but features hills, valleys, and sediment that can obscure objects. The man who would eventually find the Titanic was Dr. Robert Ballard, an oceanographer and underwater archaeologist who had pioneered the use of deep-sea robotic vehicles for exploration. Ballard had long dreamed of finding the Titanic, but funding such an expensive expedition was difficult. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: the U.S. Navy. In 1985, the Navy was interested in developing technology to locate and examine 2 sunken nuclear submarines, the USS Thresher and USS Scorpion. They agreed to fund Ballard's search for the Titanic, but only after he had first located and examined the 2 submarines. This arrangement remained secret for years. Ballard's search strategy was based on a key insight. Rather than looking for the intact ship, he should look for the debris field. When the Titanic sank, thousands of objects fell from the ship and scattered across the ocean floor, everything from coal to dishes to personal belongings. This debris field would cover a much larger area than the ship itself and would be easier to detect. On September 1st, 1985, after weeks of searching with the remotely operated vehicle Argo, Ballard's team spotted debris on their video monitors. At first, they saw scattered objects, then a ship's boiler appeared on the screen. There was no doubt they had found Titanic. The discovery made headlines around the world. Ballard returned in 1986 with the submersible Alvin and the robotic vehicle Jason Jr. to conduct a detailed examination of the wreck. What they found both confirmed and challenged existing theories about the disaster. The ship had indeed broken in 2, with the bow and stern sections lying about 2,000 feet apart, facing in opposite directions. The bow section was relatively intact and upright on the ocean floor, though the decks had collapsed. The stern section was heavily damaged, almost unrecognizable, apparently having imploded during the descent due to air trapped inside. The debris field between and around the two sections contained thousands of objects: coal from the bunkers, dishes from the kitchens, luggage, bottles, and, poignantly, pairs of shoes marking where bodies had once lain before decomposing in the deep ocean. Ballard was adamant that the wreck site should be treated as a memorial, not plunder for artifacts. He did not retrieve any objects during his expeditions. However, others did not share his reverence. In the years that followed, numerous expeditions visited the wreck, many conducted by RMS Titanic, Incorporated, a company that was eventually granted salvage rights. These expeditions have recovered thousands of artifacts, from pieces of the ship's structure to personal belongings of passengers and crew. These artifacts have been displayed in museums and traveling exhibitions around the world, allowing millions of people to connect with the Titanic story. However, the practice remains controversial, with many arguing that disturbing the wreck site is disrespectful to the 1,500 people who died there. Following the discovery of the wreck in 1985, numerous scientific expeditions were mounted to study the Titanic and understand exactly how and why she sank. These expeditions use increasingly sophisticated technology, deep-diving submersibles, remotely operated vehicles, ROVs, sonar mapping, and eventually high-resolution photography. Each expedition added pieces to the puzzle, though some findings were controversial and led to competing theories about the disaster's specifics. One of the most important early findings concerned the nature of the hull damage. For decades, based on survivor accounts and the testimony at the 1912 inquiries, many people believed the iceberg had torn a massive gash, perhaps 300 feet long, along the side of the ship. However, when researchers were finally able to examine the actual damage in the 1990s using sonar and robotic vehicles, they found something very different. The damage consisted of a series of relatively narrow openings spread across 6 compartments, with a total area of only about 12 to 13 square feet, as Edward Wilding had estimated back in 1912. This finding raised new questions. How could such seemingly minor damage sink such a large ship so quickly? Research in the 1990s and early 2000s focused on several possible contributing factors. One theory suggested that the steel used in the Titanic's hull was brittle due to high sulfur content and would have been particularly vulnerable to fracture in the cold water temperatures of the North Atlantic. When tested, samples of the steel recovered from the wreck did show brittleness, though whether this was due to the original composition or to a century on the ocean floor remained debated. Another theory focused on the rivets that held the steel plates of the hull together. Examination of recovered rivets showed that some were made of iron rather than steel, and that the quality of the iron varied. In the cold water and under the stress of the impact, these rivets might have popped, allowing the hull plates to separate and creating the openings through which water flooded. Another area of investigation was the breakup of the ship. Survivor accounts had always been contradictory about this. Some survivors reported seeing the ship break in two before it sank, while others insisted it sank intact. The 1912 inquiries had generally accepted the testimony that the ship sank intact, with the breaking occurring underwater or during the descent. When Ballard discovered the wreck in 1985 and found it in 2 pieces, separated by a considerable distance, it confirmed that the ship had indeed broken apart. But when and how? Studies of the wreck site suggested that the ship broke at the surface or very close to it, as the survivors who reported seeing it happen had testified. The stern section's heavy damage indicated it had imploded during the descent, probably because air was trapped inside when it sank. The question of why the ship broke in two also attracted attention. The Olympic-class ships, including Titanic, had been built with a system of expansion joints designed to allow the hull to flex with the stresses of ocean waves. However, these ships were never designed for the stresses of sinking. As the bow filled with water and sank lower, and the stern rose higher out of the water, the forces on the midship area became enormous, far beyond anything the designers had anticipated. The ship was essentially being bent in the middle, with the flooded bow pulling down and the still buoyant stern pushing up. Eventually, the structural members, the steel beams, deck plates, and hull plating simply couldn't take the strain, and the ship fractured. The violence of this breakup is evident in the condition of the wreck, with twisted metal and scattered debris marking the point where the ship tore apart. By the early 2020s, technology had advanced to the point where it was possible to create a complete digital record of the Titanic wreck, with unprecedented detail. In the summer of 2022, a team assembled by Magellan Ltd., a deep-sea mapping company, and Atlantic Productions, which was creating a documentary about the project, descended to the wreck site with a suite of advanced equipment. Over the course of 6 weeks, remotely operated vehicles equipped with high-resolution cameras and scanning equipment methodically surveyed every inch of the wreck and the surrounding debris field. The scale of the operation was massive. The ROVs captured 715,000 individual images of the wreck from every conceivable angle. They also used sonar and LiDAR scanning to precisely measure distances and create a three-dimensional map of the site. The resulting dataset was enormous, many terabytes of information. Back on land, this data was processed using sophisticated photogrammetry software to create what the team called a digital twin of the Titanic, a complete, accurate, three-dimensional digital model of the wreck as it exists today. The model is so detailed that individual rivets are visible, and so comprehensive that it includes not just the two main sections of the ship, but the entire debris field spread across the ocean floor. The digital twin represents a revolution in how we can study the Titanic. Previously, researchers had to rely on video footage and still photographs taken during manned or robotic dives to the wreck. These provided valuable information, but they were limited. Video footage shows only what the camera was pointing at during the dive, and the murky water, poor lighting, and limited time on the bottom meant that much of the wreck remained unphotographed or poorly documented. The digital twin, by contrast, provides a complete picture. Researchers can visit the wreck virtually, examining it from any angle, zooming in on details, and even stripping away the layers of sediment and rust in the computer model to see the underlying structure. It's as close as we can come to raising the Titanic itself. When the digital twin was analyzed, it revealed numerous details that had been missed or poorly understood in previous expeditions. The open valve on the stern, indicating steam flow, and the concave boilers, proving they were still operating when submerged, provided the evidence of the engineer's heroism we discussed earlier. The skin also revealed the small porthole that had been smashed during the collision, corroborating survivor accounts of ice entering cabins. It showed the pattern of debris spread across the ocean floor, giving insights into how the ship broke apart and how objects fell during the sinking. It even revealed previously unknown damage to various parts of the ship's structure. The digital twin has also been combined with advanced computer simulations to recreate the collision and sinking. By inputting data about the ship's speed, weight, and structural characteristics, along with information about ice density and ocean conditions, researchers have been able to simulate the collision with remarkable precision. This is how they determined that just 6.3 seconds elapsed from the moment the iceberg was spotted to the moment of impact. The simulations have also modeled how the water flooded through the ship, how the stresses build up in the hull structure, and how the ship eventually broke apart. These simulations are helping to answer questions that have persisted for more than a century and are providing insights that will inform ship design and safety for years to come. In July 2024, RMS Titanic Incorporated, the company that holds salvage rights to the wreck, mounted another expedition to the site. This was the first expedition to visit the wreck since the tragic Titan submersible disaster in June 2023, when 5 people died when their submersible imploded during a descent to view the Titanic. The 2024 expedition was therefore conducted with extreme caution and with enhanced safety protocols. The team included oceanographers, scientists, historians, and imaging specialists. Over a 20-day period, they conducted multiple dives to the wreck using ROVs, capturing more than 2 million new photographs and hours of video footage. One of the primary goals of the 2024 expedition was to document the ongoing deterioration of the wreck. The Titanic has been on the ocean floor for more than 112 years, exposed to salt water, extreme pressure, cold, and the action of bacteria that consume iron. The wreck is literally being eaten away by microorganisms, particularly a species of bacteria called Halomonas titanici, discovered on the wreck and named after the ship. These bacteria consume the iron, creating the characteristic rust formations called rusticless that hang from the wreck like icicles. The 2024 expedition documented how much the ship has deteriorated since previous visits. The findings were sobering. Comparison of the new images with photographs from earlier expeditions showed significant decay. Perhaps most dramatically, a section of railing on the port side of the bow, measuring approximately 15 feet long, had completely collapsed and disappeared since it was last photographed in 2022. This railing was on the forward deck, an iconic part of the ship made famous by the 1997 James Cameron film. Its loss represents a significant change to the wreck's appearance. Other areas of the ship also showed increased deterioration, with metal continuing to corrode and structures continuing to collapse under their own weight and the pressure of the deep ocean. However, the 2024 expedition also documented some surprisingly good news. The team captured detailed images of the stern section and found that while it remains badly damaged, certain recognizable features are still visible, including parts of the poop deck railing and some of the ship's fittings. They also rediscovered an artifact that had been thought lost. In 1986, during one of the early expeditions to the wreck, researchers had photographed a bronze statue of the Roman goddess Diana that had been part of the first-class lounge's ornate decoration. The statue had not been seen in subsequent expeditions, and many feared it had been lost or buried in sediment. The 2024 expedition team rediscovered it lying in the debris field, still remarkably intact. The documentation from the 2024 expedition has added to the comprehensive record of the Titanic wreck created by the 2022 to 2023 Digital Scanning Project. Together, these efforts are creating a detailed archive that will allow future generations to study the wreck even if, or more likely, when it eventually collapses entirely. Scientists estimate that the Titanic may completely deteriorate within the next few decades. The wreck is in a delicate state, and each year that passes sees more metal consumed by bacteria, more structures collapsing, and more of the ship returning to the basic elements from which it was made. This makes the work of documenting the wreck all the more urgent and important. The 2024 expedition also served another purpose: memorial. The team conducted ceremonies at the wreck site to honor those who died in the disaster. They laid a wreath and observed moments of silence, acknowledging that while the Titanic has become a subject of scientific study and public fascination, it is first and foremost a grave site where more than 1,500 people lost their lives. This dual nature of the wreck, as both a historical artifact worthy of study and a memorial that should be treated with respect, continues to inform how expeditions are conducted and how artifacts are handled. It's a balance that isn't always easy to maintain, but it's one that those who work with the Titanic take seriously. The new evidence gathered from the 3D digital twin created in 2022 to 2023 and the 2024 expedition has fundamentally changed our understanding of the Titanic disaster in several important ways. First and foremost, it has provided definitive physical proof of details that were previously based only on survivor testimony. The heroism of the ship's engineers, who kept the power running until nearly the very end, is no longer just a story passed down by survivors. It's a fact proven by the physical evidence of the open steam valve and the concave boilers visible in the wreck. This confirmation elevates these 35 men, all of whom perished, to their rightful place as heroes of the disaster whose sacrifice gave others a chance to survive. The precise documentation of the iceberg damage has also changed our understanding. The revelation that 6 relatively small breaches, totaling only about 12 square feet, were sufficient to sink the largest ship in the world demonstrates how vulnerable even the most sophisticated engineering can be when critical systems are compromised. The Titanic's designers had created a ship that could survive significant damage, but the specific pattern of damage the iceberg caused, spread across 6 compartments, was beyond what the design could handle. This wasn't a failure of engineering per se, but rather a catastrophic combination of circumstances that overwhelmed the ship's safety systems. The new computer simulations based on the 3D scan data have provided unprecedented insight into the timeline and physics of the disaster. The calculation that just 6.3 seconds elapsed from the moment the iceberg was spotted to the moment of impact puts the collision in stark perspective. For decades, people have second-guessed the actions of First Officer Murdoch and wondered if different maneuvers might have avoided the collision. The simulations make clear that given the ship's speed, size, and the distance to the iceberg when it was spotted, avoiding collision was physically impossible. Murdoch did exactly what he was trained to do and what any competent officer would have done. The tragedy wasn't caused by human error in those final seconds. It was caused by decisions made earlier, including the decision to maintain speed despite ice warnings and the fundamental design limitation of the watertight compartment system. The documentation of the ship's violent breakup provides new understanding of the final moments of the disaster. The ship didn't simply split cleanly in two as some had imagined. The breakup was a chaotic, violent event that literally tore the ship apart, explaining the extensive damage visible at the break point and the wide scattered debris in that area. This violent end helps explain some of the trauma experienced by survivors who witnessed it. They weren't just watching a ship sink. They were watching it being destroyed by forces it was never designed to withstand. The brief moment when the stern settled back after breaking free from the bow, giving false hope before it too sank, adds another layer of tragedy to an already tragic story. Perhaps most importantly, the new evidence reminds us that history is not fixed and final. For more than a century, people thought they understood what happened to the Titanic. The basic facts were known. The ship hit an iceberg, it sank, and more than 1,500 people died. But the details, the precise nature of the damage, the exact sequence of events, the actions of individuals in those final hours, have been subject to interpretation, speculation, and sometimes myth. The new technology that allowed the creation of the digital twin has provided a level of detail and accuracy that previous generations could never have achieved. It has turned speculation into fact and confirmed or refuted theories that have been debated for decades. This isn't just important for historical accuracy, though that alone would justify the work. Understanding exactly what happened to the Titanic has practical applications for modern maritime safety. The lessons learned from the Titanic disaster led to the creation of international safety regulations that have saved countless lives over the past century. The new evidence adds to those lessons. For example, the documentation of how the ship broke apart provides data for engineers designing modern ships, helping them understand the stresses that can occur in extreme circumstances. The confirmation of how small breaches distributed across multiple watertight compartments can doom even a large ship has implications for how compartmentalization systems are designed. The new evidence also serves to honor the memory of those who died. Every detail recovered from the wreck, every fact confirmed, every myth dispelled brings us closer to the truth of what those 2,224 people experienced on the night of April 14th to 15th, 1912. The engineers who stayed at their posts, the musicians who played until the end, the officers who maintained order as long as they could, the passengers who gave up their seats in lifeboats so others might live. All of these people deserve to have their stories told accurately. The physical evidence from the wreck ensures that their sacrifice and suffering are not forgotten or distorted by time. As the wreck continues to deteriorate, accelerating the documentation efforts becomes more urgent. Within a few decades, the Titanic may collapse entirely, the metal consumed by bacteria, the structure succumbing to pressure and time. When that happens, the digital twin and the millions of photographs taken during recent expeditions will be all that remains, a virtual Titanic that future generations can study and learn from. In a sense, this represents a different kind of preservation, one that uses technology to capture and save what physical preservation cannot. The story of the Titanic has always been more than just a story about a shipwreck. It's a story about human ambition and hubris, about the limits of technology, about heroism and cowardice, about class and privilege, about how we respond to disaster. The new evidence doesn't change the fundamental tragedy of what happened, but it does give us a clearer, more accurate understanding of the events. It reveals hidden details, like that open steam valve, like those concave boilers, like the precise pattern of hull breaches, that change how we understand the disaster. In the end, the most important thing the new evidence reveals is the truth. After 113 years on the ocean floor, the Titanic is still teaching us lessons, still revealing secrets, still commanding our attention and respect. The hidden details that new technology has uncovered don't diminish the tragedy. They deepen our understanding of it. They remind us that behind every historical event are specific, precise details that matter. They show us that even when we think we know a story completely, there may be more to discover. and they ensure that the memory of those who died on the Titanic and those who survived to tell their stories will be preserved and honored for generations to come. The wreck on the ocean floor may one day disappear entirely, consumed by time and bacteria, but thanks to the new evidence and the technology that captured it, the truth of what happened that terrible night will remain. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. See you next time